Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for another very special edition of WOWSA Live with our host, Ned Dennison. Ned?
Hello, everyone. I'm the chairperson of the International Marathon Swimming Hall of Fame. As we've talked over the last months, this is a team sport. We focus on a lot of swimmers and not so many contributors. Our guest today is one of the great contributors, Lynn Blouin. Lynn Blouin, let's do it the way I can pronounce it, from Quebec in Canada. And so welcome, Lynn.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be there.
Please tell us about your kind of life career before you got involved with marathon swimming administration and organizing.
Well, born and raised in Magog, so the lake has always been part of our life and our surroundings. And went to school in Sherbrooke, did my degree in career counseling, and ended up as a journalist. And that's one of the way that I got acquainted with the race, closer actually, than I was as a citizen.
And how exactly did they rope you into decades of volunteer activity on this race? Did somebody have a drink with you one time, or did they tell you they desperately needed you? Did they tell you that it would lead to riches? How did they entice you?
Yeah, exactly. No, actually, it was when I was a journalist that I got getting closer to the swimmers, getting closer to the organization. I kind of find myself, wanting to do more, and asking actually to be involved. Also, had a very strong sense of community within, a small town. So I guess that helped.
So for those who aren't familiar, Magog is a town city just north of the American border in Quebec. And south of that is an incredibly small town called Newport in the state of Vermont. And Vermont is somewhere just above New York and over a bit from Boston, to give you some sort of geography. Tell us about the evolution of this race from kind of the late 70s till present, the different courses that were run, in particular the years where it crossed the border, which I think people find fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, from 1979, first time, until 2004, it was really, the total crossing of the lake starting in Newport. It's a 40 kilometers long lake, very long, not so wide, about 2 kilometers wide all around. It's a lake that's formed as a J, and the longest part coming from Mount Alved towards Magog. So the swimmers had to swim about 8K in the US, and then they would pass this island that's called Province Island, and they knew when they were about a third of the island that they were crossing the border on the lake. So so as I said, from 1979 up until 2004. After that, the organizers, because the regulations, and after the 2001 events, it became more and more difficult to cross the border with swimmers coming from some countries. We had a specific event in 2003 with an Egyptian swimmer that was very hard. The young swimmer was named Mohamed Hassan. And when we, the organization had to set everything up for the swimmers to be able to pass the borders on the eve of the race, and get their passports in order and everything that had to be done. And we're in contact with the agents from the border days in advance. And when we arrived with the bus for the swimmers to get in the States, they took Mohamed Hassan aside, and because his name was similar to a name that they had on their list of not wanted, he had to pass all sorts of tests, fingerprints, and the eye test and everything, and he stayed there. He couldn't get in the States to swim the 1K demonstration. And on the next morning, he had to redo all the tests again before entering. And because he was entering the States by car, he had to get out of the United States the same way, by car. So, so we left that morning, escorted by agents on the lake, and he swam all the way to Magog, and he was not allowed to set foot on the land. So we took him and put him in a boat. And at that time, he got out his passport from his bag and showed it to the whole crowd. And we had to drive him back by boat to Newport. And then he was coming on the land. So, you know, that kind of was, and we knew that it was not, you know, get any easier. So the next year, the organizations decided to cut the distance and swim from Magog to Georgeville, which is about halfway through the lake. So it became a 32 kilometers race from Magog to Georgeville and back. But it changed for the swimmers, for the people, but mainly for the swimmers who had swam the real crossing. You know, the fact that they were, because it's not all the races that, you know, has this, that are unique in that way, that you go from one end of a lake to the other, and you can say that you have crossed the lake. And, you know, the fact that it was going from the States to Canada, it had a very, very unique spirit to it. So it was never the same again for the swimmers.
For those of you who might be a couple of steps ahead of us, Phil White in Vermont does run something called the Border Busters, which starts in Newport, goes up to the border. I think you swim a meter the other side, but you're not supposed to, then you come back again. So it's kind of the early half of that swim.
Exactly.
A lot of people will look to Lac Saint-Jean as the sort of gold standard of swims in Quebec. What did you folks do differently? What did you try to copy from them? And did you have the 1.5 long kilometer dinner table that they had from time to time?
No, we didn't. Saint John, Robertval, the city in which the swim is, and the whole area is very different. We have very different environment, very different cultures also with our communities. So it's not exactly the same. I'd say that the people that started the race, I was not part of the early days in Magog, but the people who started the race, of course, looked at what was done in Saint John, and especially race-wise, and you know, tried to benefit from the experience of Lake Saint John. But I'd say that at some point, because in both cases, it's not only about the race, it's about a festival that goes for days around the race, and that has a lot of cultural events and, you know, community events as well. And the fact that Magog is closer to Montreal, so there's a lot of people that can easily drive back and forth on the same day, on the day of the race, or during the event to take part in the festival. Early 1990s, the event grew real big. So it became a 10 days event with a lot of cultural events, art exhibitions, and also a lot of other sports events. We had a sailing competition, we had a canoe competition, cycling, baseball. So it drew a lot of attention and a lot of media attention to the event in Magog, because it was closer and easier for journalists to drive in and out. So it created kind of, I'd say, I don't know, maybe a bit of frustration at one point between the organizations, because so much attention was put on this new event for them. But I think things got really on the right track. I'd say mid-1990s, when the IMSA came together, and Saint John and Magog had to work together a lot. And then we tried to, at that point, and we even had meetings in Quebec City where we would meet halfway, actually, geographically, and we could exchange on, we were quite performant on the volunteer side, and the spirit, the family spirit that was through the event. They were very, very strong, always have been on the security side, which at one point we had things to learn from. So we exchanged a lot of information at that time.
And were these the only two one-week festivals in Quebec, or did many
no.
small towns have this same festival?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, Quebecers are quite festive. So the summer, you know, starts in June. You've got huge, well, not this summer, obviously, but you have huge festivals in Montreal, of course, and Quebec City. A lot of more cultural, I would say, but there's also a big, other big sporting events. Triathlon has grew very, very strong in the area here. We hold every summer, again, not this one, but a triathlon that draws over 2,000 athletes in Magog. So it's very big, but yeah, no, it was not. So, you know, well, at that time, there were 1980s, there were a little less festivals like that, but in the 19s and 2000, it just like blew up. And that's also one thing that made it harder for Magog to continue, because it was not only about the race, but the festival.
You came at an interesting time in our sports history, and this is a time when I think women's prizes were separate from men's prizes. Was that always the case in your event, or did it come partway through your time there?
It was always the case in Magog, although the general ranking was it was a general ranking. The women always had prize money separate from men from the start. So, and I guess that was one of the things that the IMSA tried to establish with their races, that, you know, women would have, financially, would have the same treatment as men did.
When I look back at the history of the Memphrémagog swim, interestingly, you folks had a lot of repeat winners. And I didn't see that in most other events. So you had Paul Asmuth, who was untouchable for a few years, Diego Degano, untouchable, Chad Hunneby with a couple of wins, Stefan Lacan, Evan Stroychev, 10, 11, 12 in a row,
Yeah,
whatever,
exactly.
whatever the number was.
Counting.
Sorry, Petter, it's just some big number. It doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
Any idea why that was? Did the swimmers become more familiar with the course? Did they get their trainers organized? It just seems an odd thing.
I think the lake was a good platform for performance. As you know, the weather conditions were not that extreme here. So, you know, the water temperature rarely went under 72, 75 degrees, up to 78 or 80. So, you know, that was not really an issue for the swimmers. The waves also never were higher than 3 feet, or very, very rarely. The winds are a bit tricky though, because of the mountains, because of Mount Alzed especially, and the place where the J, you know, the longest branch of the lake sets in. So the winds were a little tricky, but I think all of that, and the fact that, as I said, the lake is narrow. So, and they had a lot of points or sites along the way that I think add a psychological factor for the swimmers who were more strategic and, you know, good performers as well. So you knew at that, when I was talking about Province Island, you know, you knew that you were crossing the border, and then you were a little less at the third of the race. And then you saw Mount Alzed, and when you passed Alzed and turned into that new branch, you knew that, you know, at that time, you would set your eyes on the Saint Benoit Abbaye, and where the monks were praying for the swimmers every year. And, you know, and then you know that you're halfway to the race. And some swimmers even recognize houses along their way once they have done it once. So I think maybe that also adds this specific, you know, impact on the strategic swimmers, as I said, that once you've done it, you knew that you knew your way around, and your way around it as well.
We'll have to ask Steve if Petter was the most religious of the swimmers and had the best in with the monks at some point. Shelly Taylor Smith, Was a serious competitor in Memphrémagog. A couple of years coming in second overall. Now, tell us the truth, Lynn. As a female, were there a few years where you were rooting for Shelly?
Of course. You know, that specific year, that was 1991, when she came in second. The thing was, a few days prior to the event, after the 2-kilometer sprint, because we always had a 2-kilometer sprint where the journalists would gather around and everything, sprint that Diego Degano won that year. He specifically said to answering a question that the day a woman would beat him, he would retreat from open water swimming. Now, 3 days later, Shelly came in second and he came in third, 3 minutes after Shelly. So you could imagine, I was not the only one screaming that day. And he was, and you also could imagine the number of journalists waiting for him to get out of the water and have comments to ask him if he would retreat or not. Unfortunately, he was rushed to the medical tent and came out the back door at one point. So he never really answered the journalist on that topic. But Shelly was a good sport on that day, and she said, "Oh, Diego was just joking around. It's his style," and so kind of got out easily of that one.
I certainly
But
have
she
heard
was a very, very strong competitive swimmer. I remember when she won Atlantic City. Was it the same year or the year after? And it was really something.
There certainly is an urban myth. We'll have to get Shelly to confirm it, but I've heard several times that as she passed Diego in the race, she took the time to have a few words with him about something like, "Come on, Diego, see if you can keep up," or something like that.
That wouldn't surprise me.
Okay, so that's it. We'll have to get Shelly on very quickly. You were an organizer of one of the key races as the IMSA came together. And for the listeners who won't be familiar with it, prior to that, there was an International Long Distance Swimming Federation, which was primarily Egyptian European based. It's an exaggeration. And then there was the World Professional Marathon Swimmers Federation, which was more Americas based. And at a certain point, you kind of all came together and agreed you would have one federation. Tell us why. As a race organizer, why would you want this? And maybe the contribution of people like Val and Roger Parsons and others.
Yeah, I was actually, those discussions I think started in the late 80s, beginning of the 1990s. I'm not really familiar with the situation of the two prior organizations, but I think one of the main reasons was to get really everybody together to give more strength and more to make the discipline, the sport, the races, the swimmers, to try to have more light on this tremendous event that was happening and did not have all the attention that we thought it should have. So I think that was one of the reasons, and the other one was probably to create that, to focus probably more on ensuring stronger and similar conditions for the swimmer to race in from one race to the other. We also, I think that the early discussions were also at that time, car racing was really strong. And, I think the people, the race organizers wanted to create kind of a circuit that would allow swimmers to build points, a point system, and to be recognized. You have this recognition that the sport didn't didn't really have at that time. And
And-
well, what can we say about Roger and Val? They moved here in Magog for almost a year on their time and money and worked on that organization. They sure contributed to educate both organizers to the reality and respect that we have to have for the swimmers, but vice versa as well. To educate the swimmers on the reality of organizers and the challenges that they have for either finances or you know, putting the races together, finding the volunteers. You know, sometimes some race did not meet the swimmers' expectations. Some organizers were a bit too loose, but some organizers worked very hard and just had challenges to face. And I think it all came together strongly because of them. And they also created this kind of family atmosphere that we were able to experience in the 1990s and early 2000s that didn't live on, unfortunately, with coming in with the 10K coming in and you know, shorter distances swimmers. But it was for the people who've touched this specific time in open water swimming. I think it's something that it's memories that everybody cherishes at this point.
For viewers who sometimes forget, people like Lynn, Valerie, Roger have given years and years of their life, have put in tremendous amounts of voluntary action. As a swimmer, I describe myself as a prima donna that shows up to some events and I like to have a good time. As an organizer, my job is to organize events so a bunch of prima donnas can show up and have a good time. And
Exactly.
the sport doesn't work without both of those doing some tremendous things. You later helped the organization and literally traveled the world to help advise organizers. Tell us about those experiences. Where did you have the most fun? Where was it the most difficult? Where did you have the best impact?
Okay, I may have to give some names here. I'd say that I started, actually, I always, I'd say 90s, almost all the decade, followed the North American races because like I could drive from one place to the other. So at that point, Magog was the first race, and then next weekend we'd go up to Lake St. John. It was about a 5-hour drive. I had friends over there, and then the next weekend we'd go up to Atlantic City. I was more of a 10 to 11 hours drive, but I would drive back and forth on Friday and coming back on Sunday, not sleeping a lot. And we would take our bikes to Atlantic City and bike around the island to follow the whole races. And at one point, I remember Titi was Claudio's coach at one bridge, just yelled that he was out of Gatorade. So we drove to a little marketplace and bought some bottles and just, you know, pitched them at the next pier so, you know, Claudio could have enough fluids to finish the race. And when he did, actually, he told us that TT drank the whole thing. So, you know, that was, but, you know, those were the days. So, and it was more like in the 1988, 98, 99, when I became General Secretary for the IMSA, that I traveled to South America. And then again, I'd say that my fondest memory is probably sitting in Claudio Plitz's living room on a Saturday night, helping out with little stuff around to prepare for his Mar del Plata race on the next day. And, you know, I was sitting in Claudio Plitz's living room. And for me, Claudio was the first winner in 1979. I was a young teenager then. I was on the shore of the lake, could not believe a human had swam. Because at that point, you know, you got to remember that extreme sports was not as common as it is today. So for someone to, and we knew the length of that lake, for someone to swim from one end to the other was almost unbelievable. And I remember watching, and you know, he was supposed to be in Magog around 1 o'clock, but actually he came more around 7 o'clock at night. So, you know, I had a sunburn like crazy, but I just couldn't leave. I just had to see that for myself. And remembering, you know, that this swimmer that I saw coming in 79, and like 20 years later, I was sitting in his living room. It was really surreal for me. So there's a lot of memories, and also parties, after races, parties in Atlantic City, which you probably can, you know, have a say on those as well. So very, very good memories. And actually last year, you know, that Paul Asmuth wrote a book, Sports of the Soul. And he asked me, he wanted to translate it in French, and he asked me to read his book and to also have one of the articles that I published years back to be in his book. And so I worked with him, and last year he came to Magog to launch his book. And not only that, but me and my son had a trip planned to California, and we stayed at his place overnight. And for my son, who has not, he's 13 years old now, and he has not been involved in that part of my life, but it opened the door for him to know his mother in a way that he doesn't, through the eyes of the swimmers, and that part of my life that has been so important. So it's, you know, it may have been unpaid and a lot of hours, almost at some point when I was president of the race in Magog, almost a full-time job, which I already had, that would pay the bills, but you know, this one aside, but those things are priceless. So maybe, you know, that's one of the reasons why we volunteer. Mainly to give, but also to receive.
Talking about extreme sports, were you following honoree Sarah Thomas's two-way Memphrémagog swim a couple of years ago?
Did a bit, but we didn't have much information on that. Unfortunately, I think it's the fact that, you know, you don't have larger events going on. It's kind of going back in the dark, unfortunately, because even the media is here in Magog, even if we share the same body of water, you know, we knew after it had happened. So
so we can't give the monks any credit for that one.
No, we can't.
And then I guess the final question for you is that at a certain point, the IMSA gave over to FINA. Mm-hmm. Tell us about the best things about going over to FINA and what some of the challenges were.
More challenges, I'd say, than, and I think the main challenge, there was probably one main challenge that was about the calendar of events. You know, FINA was used to is nationals and Europeans and most of the time, well, once every 2 years actually, with the European Championship, the races, the American races would always clash with that calendar, and that was a very strong discussion point that never really came to be settled within the organizations. And at one point, the swimmers were caught in the middle because some federations, some strong federations, imposed on their swimmers not to swim the IMSA races and to instead go to their to the FINA races. And some swimmers actually, well, they kind of like the money that was involved with our races, and we can understand that. So I did create turmoil for them to be caught in the middle. And that's one of the reasons why the IMSA paused in 2003, because we didn't want the swimmers to have that burden. So, and, you know, we knew that if there was going to be a war, we would not be the one winning. So it was, you know, no use to, but one good thing for sure is the fact that open water swimming got into the Olympics, for sure. Then again, I think the race organizers would have preferred the 25K distance to be more representative of what the endurance and, you know, the races that as we know them are. You know, 10Ks are a long pool race for us. It doesn't have the same thing for the swimmer. But you know, at least it's there, and in honor of everything that has been done by the swimmers and organizations over the years.
I think most of the swimmers until a few years ago would absolutely have preferred 25K in an epic course as opposed to in a rowing tank. Lynn, I want to thank you very, very much for your time today, and particularly want to thank you for the decades of service you put into the sport. You made a huge difference.
Both were my pleasure, believe me.